Hello and welcome to Talking General Practice, the podcast from GP Online. I'm Emma Bauer, the editor of GP Online. Today on the podcast, I'm joined by our deputy editor, Nick Bostock, to talk about some of the latest news affecting general practice. Coming up, we're discussing whether or not GPs are likely to step up collective action after GP leaders voted in favour of a ballot of the profession and for a special conference on the issues raised by the rise in employers' national insurance contributions at last week's LMCs conference. We'll be highlighting some of the other debates that were of interest from that event, including the GP jobs crisis and integrated neighbourhood teams. And we're also talking about the latest data from our GP workforce tracker and what that tells us about the state of the GP workforce. Our good news story this week is about a report that sets out the evidence to support the use of social prescribing. That's all to come on this episode of Talking General Practice. So first up, let's talk about collective action, employers' national insurance contributions and what happened at last week's England LMC conference. Nick, there was a lot of anger at the conference about the rise in employers' national insurance, wasn't there? And delegates actually voted to hold a special conference to talk about the impact of all of this. What were GPs saying?
We knew already that GPs were really angry and worried about the financial implications of the budget, both in terms of the rise in employer national insurance contributions and the rise in the minimum wage. And we said a couple of weeks ago on the podcast, actually, that one estimate suggested an average GP practice could face extra costs of £47,000 a year because of the budget. And we talked about how the extra costs could effectively wipe out half of this year's contract uplift. So the conference very much reflected that mood. GPs talked about how general practice was being set up for collapse and about the government just not seeming to understand the profession properly in the way it was funded. Some of that, this sense that the government doesn't really understand general practice, is very much linked to statements from ministers suggesting that GPs are part of the private sector when in fact they're defined as public sector in various bits of legislation. And some of the speakers talked about how angry they felt about that in particular. Because of this confusion, GPs are being told on the one hand that they won't be protected like other bits of the public sector from these costs that have come from the budget. But on the other hand, they're being told also that they're not eligible for protections available to small businesses because, as we've said, they're actually part of the public sector. In terms of the actual conference motion that GPs voted on at the conference, and they voted in favour of this, it warned that the national insurance changes meant general practice was no longer sustainable as a business model and that the changes announced in the budget had the potential to collapse general practice. And it said too that widespread redundancies and practice closures were highly likely as a result of the changes announced in the budget. LMC representatives, these are GPs at the conference, voted to warn the government that it needed to announce funding immediately to fix the problem, by promising additional funding for general practice to cover all these extra costs. And then, as you said, they voted to hold this special conference of LMCs. And the point of this special conference, according to the wording agreed by LMCs, will be to discuss and determine what escalatory steps will be needed to ensure the survival of what still remains of English general practice. So you mentioned the question of whether GPs are likely to step up industrial action, and we'll come on to that a bit more in a minute. But this special conference could be a big part of determining what action GPs take.
That debate about the increase in employers' national insurance came towards the end of the conference, the end of the day, didn't it? And it was an extra motion that was kind of added in towards the date the conference was held. So earlier on in the day, the GPs who were there had actually voted on a motion that had been in the agenda for quite a long time, which we talked about, I think, on the last podcast. So that motion had a number of elements of it, all about stepping up collective action, and the conference backed all of it, basically. It called on the BMA to ballot the profession on taking more significant industrial action, highlighting concerns that the current wave of collective action was not having enough impact, as the motion said, to drive the changes that are needed to ensure the survival of general practice. I'll come on to talk a little bit about what sort of impact collective action is having on the ground in a minute. But the vote was very much in favour of taking that step, which I think indicates that GPs are worried that they need to do more to pressure the government to deliver an increase in practice funding. The motion also called for a recognition that this phrase that was used quite a lot in the conference, it's called restore the core. They said that that was vital to the survival of general practice. And that this needs to be the BMA's main slogan, as it were, for contract negotiations for next year. And basically what GPs and LMCs who are at that conference want to see is for extra funding going into core GP funding, not anywhere else. And that came through loud and clear from lots of the speakers. And we know that is actually a priority for the GP committee chair, Dr. Katie Bramall-Stainer, anyway. She's already said that that's really important in any future contract. So as I said, Nick, they'd already voted in favour of balloting the profession on more significant industrial action. And then in that debate that you were talking about, they voted to hold this special conference on the employer national insurance changes. So what exactly will the special conference do? Why is it significant? And how could it affect this whole ballot idea?
So a special conference of LMCs is a fairly rare event, usually triggered by something that's really infuriated GPs and often linked to some sort of possibility of industrial action or a significant action by the profession. The last one was in early March 2020, right before the first COVID lockdown, as it happens. And at that time, GPs were furious about plans for primary care networks, which they felt were a threat to general practice. And there was another one in 2016, when GPs threatened mass resignation over underfunding. So actually it's every 4 years, a bit like Olympics or something, isn't it? These conferences come when general practice is really furious about something and that GPs feel as a profession they need to stand up strongly and push back. In this case, though, there's a bit of overlap between the conference and some of the action general practice is already involved in. As you said, LMCs voted last week for a ballot on more significant industrial action. So that's already policy and should be going ahead. One speaker at the LMCs conference pointed out last week that a special conference costs more than £100,000 to put on, and that given there was already collective action taking place, there's already a vote for a ballot on more action, maybe a special conference isn't necessary. And it's also worth mentioning that if the government comes back and says it will provide extra money to support GPs with the costs linked to the budget, that might slightly negate the need for a special conference too. We don't know yet when a special conference would actually happen. It's likely to be a few months off at least. So plenty could actually change between now and whatever the BMA finally sets. But ultimately, LMCs felt the cost implications from the budget and the fact that the government has failed to give a clear indication of whether GPs will be shielded from the impact these extra costs are going to have is so serious that a standalone event is necessary. I wonder if the BMA will hold off on the ballot on stepping up action until after the special conference takes place. And if so, the conference could be an opportunity to discuss how action could be stepped up, what form action could take, so it could perhaps feed into shaping what that ballot will look like, what exactly GPs are going to be asked. So whether we're talking about a nuclear option, like a return to that 2016 threat of a mass handback of contracts, for example, or something else, just like dialing up the current collective action a bit.
The other thing that sort of happened just ahead of the conference last week is that the Health and Social Care Secretary, Wes Streeting, wrote to the BMA GP Committee Chair, Dr. Katie Bramall-Stainer, about the implications of the budget. And he said the government was working fast to finalise GP funding for 2025-26. What exactly did he say in that letter?
This letter was a response to a letter that Katie Bramall-Stainer sent to the Health and Social Care Secretary about a week earlier. So she asked in that letter for unequivocal confirmation that GP practices would not have to shoulder the costs of the budget changes. And ultimately, Wes Streeting's response fell short of confirming that. What he did say is that he recognised that if the government wanted to achieve its stated aim of moving care out of hospitals into the community, maintaining the stability of GP practices in the short term is essential. And he also said that cutting NHS waiting lists and getting the health service back to hitting some of the core targets in the NHS constitution is not going to happen without general practice being able to play its part. Wes Streeting also said that he was working rapidly, as you mentioned, to finalise the funding envelope for general practice for the next financial year, and that work on that is going to happen over the coming weeks. But, and I think this is probably a big but, in the past few days, Stephen Kinnock, who's the primary care minister, has suggested GPs won't actually find out what their funding settlement will be until the end of normal contract negotiations. So that could mean that GPs are waiting a fair bit longer towards the end of the financial year, the beginning of the next one. And Katie Bramwell-Stainer mentioned the Health and Social Care Secretary's letter in her speech at the LMCs conference. She repeated basically the warning that the cost from the budget must be resourced in full for general practice. And she pointed out as well that BMA polling shows the total impact could be more than £200 million for practices in England. That's broadly in line with what analysis from an LMC said, we talked about on the podcast last time. The rest of her speech gave a sense that although she welcomed Wes Streeting, recognising that GPs have this huge role to play in turning around the current NHS crisis, she's taking nothing for granted, and she thinks GPs need to double down, keep pushing ahead with collective action. And she actually pointed out as well that LMCs and individual practices that are normally not the ones inclined to be militant or to take action are starting to wake up. She said practices that are usually just sort of focused on keeping their heads down, getting on with patient care, even those practices now are starting to recognise the level of threat that the profession's facing. We reported a while back that the BMA said around 80% of practices were taking part in industrial action. And I wonder on this basis whether that figure might already have risen. And the message from the GP committee leadership is certainly that it needs to, that GPs need to keep the pressure on the government, and particularly, with this new financial threat from the budget in mind.
Yeah, I'm going to come on and explain a bit about what some of the GPs at the conference were saying about what they're doing when it comes to collective action. But before we get on to that letter from Wes Streeting came after he'd caused some real upset among GPs when he said that general practice was not, and I quote, formally part of the NHS. The BMA was really angry about that comment, wasn't it? And that GPs at the LMCs conference, they mentioned it quite a few times. They were quite upset about it.
So these comments were on the ITV Good Morning Britain TV programme on the 13th of November. And the programme's presenters were basically trying to get a straight answer from Wes Streeting about whether he would exempt GPs from the increased employer national insurance costs. And they made the point that, patients don't want to see the impact of this budget being a reduction in GP appointments, for example, at a time when they're already struggling to get GP appointments. And in the end, Wes Streeting was very clear on the exemption. He said the government would not be exempting GP practices from these charges. But then he also said, as part of the justification for not exempting GP practices, that GPs are, and this is the quote, not formally part of the NHS. And we're talking formally FORMALLY rather than FORMERLY. So yes, it's not about whether they were historically part of the NHS, it's about formal. Anyway, he expanded on this and he said that GPs are contracted, they're effectively private businesses providing a public service, so they're not automatically exempt. He then went on to say that he recognised the pressures on general practice and he said he wanted to deal with those pressures. But again, as has been the case with lots of these statements from the government, he didn't say unequivocally that GP practices would be protected from the national insurance costs. And as you say, the BMA and others were furious about this suggestion that GPs aren't part of the NHS somehow. We saw GPs on social media saying, I've spent my whole life working for the NHS and now I'm not part of it. The BMA Council agreed a statement that week that said they were astonished at the suggestion that GPs are not part of the NHS family. And they also said general practice faced an existential threat from the cost hikes in the budget and again called on politicians to announce plans to cover those costs. I mentioned a minute ago the letter that Katie Bramwell-Stainer sent to Wes Streeting earlier this month, and that letter's worth quoting because it sums up really well this incomprehensible position around GPs and their status as part of the health service. She said in that letter, and this is the quote, GPs and their practices across the country are reeling at the cruel anomaly of, on the one hand, being denied funding to cover the employer's national insurance contributions rise and national minimum wage increase, because according to the Treasury, we're private sector, yet equally ineligible for any reimbursements open to small private sector companies because, according to the Treasury, we're public sector.
It's a kind of almost a nonsense argument, some of that. It just makes no sense. And I can understand why GPs are really, really angry about this. We've been talking on the podcast over the last month or so, since the budget happened, about the impact it was likely to have on practices. Can practices continue to wait to find out what's going on in terms of any support they might get? You suggested there that it might not be until we find out details of next year's contract, which is potentially could run quite far into next year. How is this impacting on the day-to-day running of practices? Do we have any sense of that?
Just on that point about how long it's going to be, the budget was on the 31st of October and the end of contract negotiations. I mean, that often runs very close to the end of the previous financial year. You know, it could be up to 6 months potentially, or certainly 5 months plus, before GPs find out definitively how much money they're going to get, or if they're going to get any money to cover the costs of these changes in the budget. Even though the extra costs for national insurance and the minimum wage don't actually kick in until next April, GP practices are really worried now about their implications. And actually, this is already shaping their planning and what they're doing right now. An accountant I spoke to this week, Katie Collins, she's a partner at Ramsey Brown, gave some really startling examples of the impact it's having on practices. She said some practices were looking at the possibility of switching permanent salaried GPs they employ for ad hoc locums, because that might be a way to get around some of those extra employer national insurance costs. She said some GP partners were looking at pulling out of the NHS pension scheme to free up extra cash because of problems with cash flow that they're worried some of this is going to cause. And interestingly, this is also having an impact on pay uplifts for the current financial year too, because of the uncertainty it's created. So the 7.4% uplift to the global sum for the current financial year that the government implemented was intended to deliver this 6% pay increase for all GPs, including partners and all practice staff. And we wrote at the time the uplift was announced that it was unlikely to deliver a pay increase anywhere near that for most GP partners once they'd passed on the rise to salaried GPs and other staff. And a survey we published this week actually confirms that most partners didn't get any pay rise at all. But since the extra funding only came through to practices from September for the current financial year's uplifts, some of them are still debating whether they can afford to implement the full pay rise for staff. And now that the budget has come along and threatened to reverse a lot of that uplift, as we've talked about, the scales have tipped. And practices that have already awarded the pay uplift may be regretting doing so. Others that have yet to do so are thinking again. So that the budget isn't just a future issue, it's very much affecting general practice and practice staff in the here and now.
Definitely. It's quite hard to see how practices can plan ahead until they know what's going on with that. Some of the costs involved for some practices are actually quite staggering as well. GPs were standing up at that conference. I heard people quoting figures. We did say this as well from our own survey, didn't we? Last time we spoke, £100,000. I heard someone else saying it was going to cost their practice, combined with the national minimum wage rise, up to £150,000. I mean, they're huge sums of money we're talking about for what are small businesses.
Absolutely. If you're talking about £40,000 or £50,000 or whatever it is as an average, then obviously for larger practices, for practices with particular profile in terms of their staff, that means they're more exposed than some others to the cost of those employer national insurance contribution increases, then the rises are much, much deeper, as you say.
So I said earlier we talk about the impact collective action is having on the ground. It might be worth doing that now as well. So during the conference last week, the LMC conference, there was a theme debate about collective action, and a lot of the delegates used that as an opportunity to explain what was working and what wasn't in their areas. And actually there was a lot of positive stories, particularly around serving notice on unfunded or underfunded work and work that wasn't properly commissioned. In some areas, practices had done this en masse. Serving notice on that work had forced integrated care boards to come back and negotiate terms for those services, either by increasing payments or actually starting to pay practices for the work, or changing the way some of those services worked so they were less onerous for practice. So that's a sign of some success. A lot of the things that LMCs had targeted, a part of this seemed to be around shared care arrangements. So some LMCs had particularly focused on handing back work that they felt had left practices nurses and GPs facing high levels of risk around sort of monitoring patients on behalf of secondary care or prescribing. A few things that were mentioned were particularly psychiatric prescribing, some of the ADHD shared care work that practices have often felt they've no option to take on because of long waits for treatment. But in reality, they're not necessarily being paid appropriately to do that work. A couple of things that came through in that debate: there's a lot of confusion around where the primary secondary care interface starts and stops from GPs and hospital doctors, I think. So I think we could see some more material coming out from the BMA on that. Apparently, the BMA has produced material to inform hospital doctors about why GPs are taking collective action and why there might be some pushback on work that hospitals are asking GPs to do. So I think we'd like to see some more of that going forward. The other thing that is that one GP was saying that even if the ICB comes back and offers more money for some of this work that they've handed back or said they're not going to do in future, they don't necessarily want to ever take that work back on, because GPs feel this work really should be the responsibility of secondary care and specialists, not GPs. And so obviously I think that might be an issue we see commissioners having to deal with going forward if that's the case in many areas. Other GPs also stood up and talked about the benefits of the safe working guidance and limiting patient contacts to 25 a day. One GP said it had brought the joy back to GP consulting, really encouraged other people to try it. And I think one thing that really stood out for me was Dr. Chandra Kanaganti, who's the chair of North Staffordshire LMC. I think he really summed it up during the debate. And he said that GPs shouldn't be calling it collective action. They should be calling it corrective action. He said the profession should have been doing this years ago. Basically, practices had been working for free for a really long time. He argued that the measures practices are currently taking should basically become standard practice from here on out, and new steps should be added to collective action to put more pressure on the government to get a decent contract for general practice. That all sounds very positive. I don't think every area has necessarily had the same successes as some of those I've just mentioned. The impression I got is something that you mentioned earlier, Nick, is I think that many more GPs have probably been galvanised to perhaps look at collective action in the wake of this employers' national insurance issue. And like you said, maybe practices that had been less inclined to get involved with it, or maybe kept their head down, are actually really quite angry and quite worried about the future and are more likely to throw their hat in the ring. I think it's also worth mentioning what Katie Bramall-Stainer said in response to that debate, something she said before, that collective action is a marathon and not a sprint, that nothing would come without pain. That's something she said before as well. She said if everyone worked towards 25 patient contacts a day and serving notice on non-commissioned services, or took some of the other measures the BMA is recommending, then she said it would succeed. And she said that general practice was going to have to dig deep and do more, and that the BMA would be working on rebooting and refreshing what action looks like going forwards. But she didn't really say anything explicit about what that could mean. So maybe we might have to wait until this special conference to find out a bit more about that, or the ballot, whichever comes first. So, Nick, what happens next? Do we have any idea about what sort of action GPs could be considering to ramp up pressure on the government? I mean, we've suggested a few things they might throw in the ring, but do we know anything about where it might go?
For now, I think, kind of as you just touched on, that the BMA is probably going to be working on encouraging more practices to join in collective action and broaden the collective action they're taking. If they're currently stopping unfunded work, perhaps start to implement safe appointment limits too, for example. In terms of what action could happen next, though, that's hard to say. With this ballot on more significant industrial action, GPs voting on that would have to be clear on whether it means they're being asked about taking part in strikes, for example. The current collective action is all action practices can take without breaching their contracts. And as Chandra Kanaganti was touching on, those actions are things that the BMA has actually been saying that GPs should do for years. The safe working guidance is at least 6 or 7 or 8 years old, and they've been saying that people should impose those sort of safe limits on patient contacts. And in terms of things like delivering unfunded services, probably a quarter of a century or more, GP conferences have been carrying votes saying we have to stop unfunded work. No more work without more pay. But so industrial action in the sense of strikes would be a really big step up, and it would probably be more likely to cause problems for patients and therefore sort of tension between practices and their patients in a way that perhaps some of the collective action hasn't done. And any decision, therefore, to move towards genuine industrial action is something that most GPs are probably going to be pretty wary of. So perhaps the next steps could be just about expanding the list of actions GPs are currently taking part in through collective action, or just making sure more practices are doing what's currently on the list. But having said that, GPs are really worried about the cost implications of the budget. So maybe there will be an appetite for doing more, signing undated contract resignations or stopping services for a short time altogether, or something along those lines. And ultimately, I guess that's what the GP committee and this special conference are going to shape over the coming weeks and months.
Our survey the other week and the stuff that we were talking about on the last podcast from Berkshire, Buckinghamshire and Oxfordshire LMCs, the fact that many practices are having to weigh up whether or not they're going to even be able to afford to go forwards. If practices are in that position, then why not throw your hat in the ring and go all out for full-on big old industrial action if you're thinking you're going to have to hand your contract back within the next year if you don't get some extra funding? Or
yeah,
you don't
absolutely.
Get
What have you got to lose?
Exactly. So it's probably worth rounding up some of the other discussions from the England LMCs conference pretty quickly here, particularly those we mentioned on the last news podcast, in case you were wondering what happened. I think we discussed the jobs crisis was one issue that was going to come up at the conference, and that was discussed. GPs were very critical of the additional roles reimbursement scheme, which we've talked about a lot on the podcast before, actually. There's now around £1.4 billion a year pumped into that scheme to employ lots of different staff across primary care networks, and that's money that's gone into primary care and general practice, but not into core funding. So it means that practices are not really free to spend that money how they want. And I think it's partly because of that now this emphasis on restoring core funding has become such a focus for the BMA. And obviously they can't spend that £1.4 billion bit of the ARRS money on employing GPs. One GP at the conference described the ARRS as a tool of mass general practice destruction. So, they weren't shy about coming out against that. They voted again for that money to be moved into core funding, which we know the BMA wants to happen. They also talked about GPs being added to the ARRS and said this was too little too late to sort out the jobs crisis. A couple of GPs, including one GP registrar who's due to qualify soon, were very critical of the jobs that are available through that scheme. Someone described the idea of GP jobs being additional as absurd, which was a pretty good point, I thought. There was also an interesting debate that was worth mentioning. We didn't actually write about this, but it's just quite an interesting debate about integrated neighbourhood teams as well. I think we're going to be hearing a lot about these in the coming months. All integrated care boards are trying to create these teams, but I think there's quite a lot of variation about what they look like and how they work from area to area. Obviously, we know that this Labour government is really keen on creating a neighbourhood NHS, and it's likely these teams could form the basis of that in the future, particularly in areas where they're a bit further along in that process. So they're potentially very important, I think. Unsurprisingly, the conference voted overwhelmingly in favour of general practice being at the heart of these teams, but they rejected a call that was part of the motion for the BMA to push for community nursing teams and all the funding associated with them to be moved into general practice. I think there was a general feeling that that's just too much for overstretched practices to take on at the minute. One thing that did come out of that debate, which I think is important to mention, is that there's an exception that GPs and general practice really need to engage with this work around neighbourhoods in particular to ensure that how things develop is in the best interest of patients, but also because if GPs aren't properly involved, these neighbourhood teams could end up creating more work for practices. But then the problem with that is that takes a lot of time, and that's inevitably takes GPs out of clinical practice to focus on organisational issues. One GP mentioned that if the NHS is serious about making these teams work, then ICB's politicians, they need to give the people involved the time and the headspace to develop the relationships that are needed to make them work. But as we know from PCNs and when they started, often there's very little management time set aside for this sort of work in primary care, and often a real lack of organisational support to help these initiatives get off the ground. And GPs were really expressing some concerns about that, and also about the fact that it's important for GPs and general practice to be able to retain their autonomy within these teams and be trusted to do the right thing, rather than these new teams becoming a way to effectively control what general practice does. So there was a lot of concern about that too. So I think that's very much watch this space about what's going on with neighbourhood teams and how they will ultimately impact on general practice. And I think it's certainly a topic that we'll probably be coming back repeatedly to on the podcast in the coming weeks and months. So moving on, this week we updated our GP workforce tracker, which forms part of our GP Insight section of the website, where we analyse some of the key facts and figures and data coming out of the NHS that relates to primary care. So Nick, what did we find with our latest update?
There's all sorts of data in the GP Insight section on the GP workforce, patients per GP, appointments, patient satisfaction and so on. But the first thing we've pulled out to look at this week in a bit more detail is around the figures on patients per GP. What we're talking about here is actual patients, not weighted patients. So these figures aren't factoring in things like the age of the population and so on that GP pay is weighted to account for. We're just looking at how many patients overall there are for each fully qualified full-time equivalent GP in each area. And what we found is that over the past 2 years, so between September 2022 and September 2024, the gap between areas with the most patients per GP and the fewest patients per GP has grown. There are currently 2,273 patients per fully qualified full-time equivalent GP in England as a whole. But in the ICB area with the most patients per GP, which is Bedfordshire, Luton and Milton Keynes ICB, it's 2,919. So almost 3,000 patients for every fully qualified GP in that area. That's 55% more patients per GP than the ICB with the fewest patients per GP, which is Cornwall and Isles of Scilly, where there are 1,878. So that 55% gap between ICBs in terms of the number of patients each GP is responsible for has grown really sharply in the past 2 years. In 2022, the gap was 43%, so it's still pretty big, but it's obviously getting bigger quite quickly. Some GPs, and we've written a lot about this in the past, quote this figure of 1,800 patients per GP as a safe limit, and there is not a single ICB in the country that meets that level at the moment. But what we can see from the figures is that some ICBs are moving further away from that safe level. Another point worth making here is that, like I say, no ICB currently meets that safe limit. And these figures are averages across large areas. So when you look down to individual GP practices or to PCNs, the figures can look a lot worse still in terms of, the number of patients that GPs are actually responsible for. The RCGP told me that basically their view is that the whole of England is underdoctored, but that ultimately it shouldn't be the case that a GP in one part of the country is looking after nearly twice as many patients as a GP somewhere else. I mean, the gap is more than 1,000 patients. The college says as well that the underdoctored areas are often the most deprived, and because of this, it says that although there's a need for a step change overall in investment in general practice in England, and this call for a bigger share of the NHS budget to go to general practice, that investment needs to be targeted disproportionately to those deprived areas, which traditionally haven't fared so well under the existing GP funding formula.
It's a really good point, that. If anyone's interested in finding out a bit more about that and about how to make GP funding fairer, you should have a listen to that podcast that I did a few weeks ago with Dr. Bex Fisher from the Nuffield Trust, because she is a real expert in this and has spent a lot of time looking at how funding could be changed to make it fairer, in particular to target deprivation. So do look out for that, and you can find that in our podcast feed or on our website. And also you can find all of our analysis of key NHS data on the GP Insight section of GPonline.com. And that's where you can also access the GP workforce tracker, which has pages for each of England's 42 integrated care boards, where we look at the data, including the number of GPs per patient, the proportion of GPs who are partners, and the proportion of GPs aged 55 and over at ICB, sub-ICB and PCN level, and also look at how things have changed over time in each of those ICBs. And you can find all of that at GPonline.com/GP Insight. Before we finish, we've just got time for our good news slot, and this week it's about social prescribing. Last week, the National Academy for Social Prescribing published a report looking at the impact of social prescribing on health service use and costs. The report highlighted analysis of data from 9 areas in England to establish what difference social prescribing is making on each of these issues. The overall results suggest that social prescribing leads to big reductions in both the cost of delivering healthcare and the use of services. And perhaps unsurprisingly, these results were particularly pronounced in people who are frequent users of NHS services. One of the evaluations in Tameside and Glossop found a 42% reduction in GP appointments in just over 1,700 patients who used social prescribing after 12 months, compared to a 5.6% reduction in a control group who were offered social prescribing but did not take that up. An evaluation in Calderdale found that there was an average of 9 GP contacts per year before patients were offered social prescribing, which reduced to 5 per year after they started seeing a social prescribing link worker. The project also found that social prescribing was linked to significantly lower healthcare costs, potentially saving £350 per patient per year. We've got a piece on the website from the Chief Executive of the National Academy for Social Prescribing, Charlotte Osborne-Ford, highlighting some of the findings from the report and other data that shows the benefits of social prescribing, and we'll put a link to that and the NASP report in the notes for this episode. I should be speaking to Charlotte Osborne-Ford in an upcoming episode of the podcast about some of the findings from this report, the work the National Academy for Social Prescribing is doing, and social prescribing more generally, so keep an eye out for that. Well, that's it for this week. Thanks to Nick, and thanks so much for listening. I'll be back next week, so please do join me then. In the meantime, don't forget you can keep up to date with all the latest news affecting general practice and access lots of other resources on our website at GPonline.com.